Well, turning our attention now to some international affairs that you probably have not heard of. Brazil's not a country that's been making headlines in Australia recently, at least not since the end of President Jair Bolsonaro's reign earlier this year. But that doesn't mean there aren't things that we ought to be paying attention to. And in fact, there's some very serious things going on there that reflect in some rather disturbing ways what we've seen in Washington, D.C. and what we saw on the streets of Victoria during the COVID lockdowns. Here to discuss it with me is Brazilian national, Brazilian constitutional expert and former West Australian Law Reform Commissioner, a man who certainly knows what he's talking about, Professor Augusto Zimmerman. Thank you for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks, Topher. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Now, before we get to the actual story at hand here, just for those that don't know you, don't know your work, can you give us a quick background to let us know why it is that you have a concern with what's happening in Brazil right now?
Well, it's a very serious issue. You know that there are thousands, at least 1,000 political prisoners now in Brazil. They have been arrested without any need for individualization of the charge made criminally against them. Some of these penalties are up to 17 years of jail, and you have to take into account that drug dealers, murderers in Brazil barely stay in jail. So these are people who have been criminalized for protesting against a very controversial election based on an entirely electronic voting system.
There's some very strong parallels with what's happened on January 8th of this year in Brazil versus what happened on January 6th of 2021 in Washington, D.C. Before we go there, this hit the news. The Epoch Times, an absolutely fantastic publication. I recommend you subscribe to them if you haven't already. They've covered the death of one of the alleged protesters, but you make the point that this person is not actually, was not even involved in the protests at all. What's this person's story?
No, yes, that's right. He is a businessman who was around the area and had to be protected from the violent actions of the federal police, who was called by this controversial government to take measures against those who were protesting against this, as I say again, controversial election. He was not engaged directly in these actions or any action whatsoever, but he was trying to protect himself against the violence being committed by the government. So this is the person who was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
I can certainly relate a lot to that. There were civilians that got caught up in the Victoria Police violence on the streets of Melbourne. They would take shelter, and I saw with my own eyes on at least one occasion, and have seen on video on many more occasions, people that were literally just going shopping, just out for exercise, getting arrested, getting tackled, being targeted by police. I can only imagine the situation for this gentleman. Sadly, has passed away, at least in part due to medical neglect there in prison.
Yes.
Now, a lot of people...
Can I say something?
Yeah.
About this? He was forced into mRNA vaccination, and he already had heart conditions.
Oh, wow.
Some of these people who were imprisoned were denied of even having a blanket and a pillow. And that includes the elderly and children being arbitrarily arrested. They have been in jail for more than 11 months at this point.
Now, when Jair Bolsonaro became president of Brazil, around about, I think it was 6 years ago, so 4 years ago, something like that, I remember the headlines being absolutely breathless that he was going to be the next Hitler, that he was going to cause the death of civil liberty in Brazil, that he would be imprisoning his political opponents. So it's astonishing to see that not only did he not do all of that, but actually the person who is doing all of that is on the opposite end of the political spectrum. This is a president elected under the Workers' Party. This is actually the second time that he's been president, his third term. He had a two-term stint as president previously. What are some of the changes and some of the reforms that he's brought in from an economic point of view and a socialist point of view?
Well, he is a very dictatorial person, and try to introduce some measures that would completely abolish free speech, ban free speech on the country. The good thing about this is that he was so corrupt that the many corruption scandals made his left-wing strategy of implementing a socialist dictatorship not possible in his first term. But he, during the whole campaign, was promised revenge, and it was promising to destroy freedom of speech. So at least you can
Wow.
say that he has been quite honest in his promises to destroy the rule of law and democracy in Brazil. And that he is doing it very well, I must say.
Now, coming back to these political prisoners, it does have to be said, and we'll show you some footage here, that there were certainly some ugly scenes, windows being smashed, there were people walking through government buildings, etc. There are people who would claim that this represents an attempted armed overthrow of the government. They were apparently calling on the military to step in and stage a military coup. You're from Brazil, you understand the politics and the people there much better than I do. Can you explain your view on what does this really represent? I mean, we are watching windows being smashed here. Was this a genuine threat to the government of the day?
Well, look, the person who was responsible for the security of these buildings was actually offering drinks to those who were engaged in these violent actions. And he was actually allowing
Wow.
them to enter into the premises. And we know, according to Raul Jungmann, who is former president of the Communist Party of Brazil, that the left uses this sort of strategy of infiltrating into this movement to pretend to be conservatives engaged in such actions, when as a matter of fact, this is all done by the extreme left in Brazil, who is notorious for having this sort of strategy in order to destabilize any sort of protest or movement for freedom and the rule of law and democracy. Peaceful conservative Brazilians would never engage in such violent acts of destruction if we know very well that they oppose these things for such a long time.
Mm.
And so Ives Gandra also says, Professor Ives Gandra, that being a protest consisted of primarily women, children, and the elderly, and unarmed people, this could never ever be considered, could never ever be considered a coup d'etat, because in a coup d'etat you use weapons. And the military in Brazil, a contingent of about 500,000 people, not counting, of course, the federal police and the state police, and then would go to about 1 million people, are indeed heavily armed. So it's impossible to construe those actions as a coup. It's quite possible to say, and there is enough evidence for this, that this was always staged by the Brazilian government and the extreme left in Brazil to arrest innocent people who are now in jail without due process of law and any application of principles of natural justice.
It certainly sounds like the Victoria that we were heading for under Daniel Andrews. Thankfully, he's gone, but the current president of Brazil is still very much there. Do you have much hope that democracy will continue in Brazil? Will there be another election? Will it be free and fair, or are we watching another lurch back towards a dictatorship, something that Brazil and so many South American countries seem to lurch in and out of all the time?
Well, this is a plan orchestrated by the left to stay in power ad infinitum. They were not expecting the emergency of Bolsonaro, and now they took the necessary measures to make this never happen again. So the elections are entirely untransparent. They are totally based on an electronic voting system where we are actually not able to count the votes.
Yeah.
So my prediction is that there will be never ever fair elections under the current system unless something quite extraordinary takes place. And of course, this government is so radical that the masses might one day say probably that enough is enough, and then you're going to see a bit more of meta-legal events taking place in the nation.
And that's never a pretty thing. I'm sorry to say that it seems as though Brazil might be giving us a comparison, a counterpoint to what we're anticipating in Argentina. And as much as that's certainly not good for Brazil, it certainly makes for fascinating viewing from the safe distance of the continent of Australia, and also gives us all the more reason to keep our paper-based voting system intact and not go electronic. Well,
absolutely.
Professor Augusto Zimmerman, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire. We will stay across this story, and I hope that I'm wrong about the future of Brazil. Thank you for coming on.
No, look, we will resist. Brazilians are brave and courageous, and Brazilians would never accept these current affairs. So I had hope. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain and expose what's going on over there.
Thanks, Augusto.
Thank you.